Welcome everybody. I'm so glad you all could join this webinar this evening. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Jennifer Carter and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Ardent Residential. And I have been doing community association management for over 20 years now in Georgia. Of course, tonight's webinar is going to be about leasing, your community association leasing activity, I should say. And but before I do that, I always like to just always give a disclaimer. Okay, so today's webinar, guys, is for educational purposes only and should not be considered as legal advice or counsel. Okay, you need to review your community association's governing documents for more specific detail related to your association's specific leasing provisions, or consult with your association's manager or attorney. Okay, everybody's leasing provisions and governing documents is you could see 1,000 different versions. So we are going to talk about some of those this evening. So I'm super excited to do this webinar. I'm going to just kind of go over a brief overview of the agenda, why this topic is so important and relevant to you and your community association. Why do you have to manage leasing activity within your community? Does your association have leasing provisions? What happens if they don't? What do you do if you do not have leasing provisions? What are the different types and most common provisions for leasing restrictions? What are some of the things that we see and some trends that we might be seeing some new trends? And what type of records and information do you need to keep regarding leased out lots or units? And then I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about Ardent Residential and our lease monitoring program. Okay. Make sure you guys are keeping up with your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. I will definitely get to all of the questions, time permitting, at the end of the webinar. Also, as a reminder, everybody is on mute, so I forgot to make mention of that. But again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, okay? Also, I want to just kind of back up and say this. So this webinar topic is about leasing activity within your community association. Okay. I want to make sure everyone understands that when I'm referring to the management of leasing activity, I'm actually referring to the leasing compliance within your community association. I'm not referring to the management itself of leased homes. Okay. There's a difference between that. So I want to make sure everybody understands that. So I'm going to say that again. We're not talking about the management of leased homes, meaning we're not talking about managing that property, leasing it out, managing the tenant. We're talking about monitoring the leasing compliance within your community association. Okay. Why is this topic so important? Why should it be relevant to you, either as a homeowner or a board member? Leasing restrictions have become way more complicated over the last few years because there have been so many changes in lender requirements with the economic downturn and prior to other things. There's been a lot of lenders are now requiring to have very minimal leasing investment owned properties within a community association. A lot of lenders out there will not lend to home buyers who are trying to purchase a home in a community that has way too many investors in it. If your rental rate is too high, it could prevent some sellers, including your own property, from actually selling their units, since their buyer pool essentially just shrinks dramatically. So we've got a lot of lender restrictions now, especially on the condo side. Tenant occupied homes typically, unfortunately, are not always as well maintained. I'm not going to say 100%. I'm going to say a majority. Okay, a majority of tenant occupied homes are not always maintained nearly as well as owner occupied homes, which ultimately affects property value, right? So if you're not taking care of your home and you're not doing the things that you're doing, it's going to impact other owners' property values. Meaning, if I take care of my home and I'm spending and investing money and keeping up the landscaping and making it look very, very nice from the curb, taking care of my home, and then I have neighbors around me that are leasing their homes out and they aren't taking care of their yard, they're not getting their weeds treated, they're not putting fresh ground cover down, trees are growing everywhere, shutters are falling off, they've got air conditioning units in their windows, well, that's going to drive my property values down. So lease monitoring is essentially really important to ensure that people that are leasing their homes have a permit to lease, right? If you have leasing restrictions in your community. So because if you have a leasing restriction provision in your community where the leasing restriction, let's say, is 10%, and let's say there's 100 homes in the neighborhood, that means only 10 homes can lease. If you have 30 homes leasing, you have a big problem going on in your community. Okay. We see an uptick in violation issues for sure with investment owned properties too. So just want to make sure you guys make a note of that. Many community associations are faced with the difficult choice of restricting the number of leased units in a community while trying to provide flexibility for hardships or unique circumstances of unit owners. For instance, a hardship example could be a military family that is being shipped somewhere else or having to move somewhere else. So that could definitely challenges that a board might face regarding that. Communities' number of rentals, essentially, you have to remember when you have leasing in a community, there's start dates, end dates, the duration of the lease, the tenant contact information. Those things are always changing, constantly changing. And so it's very fluid, and you need to understand that you have to, depending on your governing documents, typically speaking, if there are leasing provisions, the board does have an obligation to make sure that owners are complying with those leasing provisions as it relates to leasing in the community. Investors, unfortunately, as the time has gone on over the last few years, we have found they're working very hard to try and hide the rental activity because they know that there's going to be possibly administrative fees or fines for failure to follow the established guidelines regarding leasing. Okay. Let me see here. I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen for just 1 second. If you guys can just bear with me. All right, thanks guys. Sorry about that. My other screen was flickering and it was distracting me. So let's talk a little bit about why is the board required to manage leasing activity within your community? Again, only if there's leasing provisions, right? You have to have leasing provisions in your governing documents. Most community associations do have even sometimes very minimal. It could just be a very minimal for provision, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But basically the board must manage this because well, first, let me back up and say a lot of community association boards don't even realize that they have this responsibility, right? They don't know that they have this responsibility. If there's leasing provisions, they don't realize that they have to monitor the leasing activity within their community. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure the covenants are being enforced. So essentially, that is why the board must manage leasing activity if there are leasing provisions in your governing documents. So let's get to that. Let's talk about that. Okay, let's really talk about, let me hide this. First of all, let me just say regarding leasing provisions, okay? You need to check your governing documents. Like I told you guys at the very beginning, leasing provisions are written hundreds of different ways, and they may not necessarily be included in your governing documents. They could be amendments. You see a lot of associations that will, as boards turn over, after the declarant has left, boards will come in and they'll realize that they want to have more stricter leasing regulations in their community. And so they will get amendments passed to have more stricter leasing rules and regulations within the community. Okay. There could be many different types of leasing provisions, but what I want to say is that the most common one at a minimum that you might see is just this very simple. There may not be a leasing cap, meaning anybody can lease essentially, right? If you have 100 homes in a community, and there's no cap, 100 homes can lease out their homes, their lots, their units in that community. They don't need approval to rent in that scenario. However, the leasing provision may state an actual minimum term amount on that lease, meaning that it could state leases must be at least 12 months, right? You must have a lease that's 12 months, which really is essentially saying no short-term rentals. That's what that really means, no short-term rentals. And the second provision you really see that's very common is the investor / owner / landlord, which here they're all considered the same thing. Owner, investor, landlord, they're all the same person, must supply a copy of their lease to the board. Those are the simplest of simplest, okay, of the provisions that you're going to see. You'll see a lot of the minimum lease terms of the 12 months, like I said. You could see that the rented homes, they must show exactly when the lease ends or when the lease starts, when the lease actually starts and when it ends. You can see a little bit more stricter caps. Sometimes you see a 5% cap or a 10% cap, just to say, if we have 100 homes and we have a 10% cap, only 10 people can get permits. Okay. Outside of that, owners have to go on a wait list. They call it a wait list and wait for a permit to become available. There could be a requirement that there is an acknowledgement that the tenant signs stating that they understand that they live in a covenant protected community and that they must abide by the rules and regulations. Okay, there could be some language to that effect. There could be insurance document requirements, meaning they might have to provide at least a renter's insurance policy to the association along with the lease to ensure that they're insured. And then you're starting to see a lot more language about provisions as it relates to Airbnbs. That's become a big hot topic over the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years, with folks trying to do Airbnb, which is essentially short-term leasing. Okay. And it could also be classified as, in some scenarios, as running a business out of your home. And under your use restrictions in your governing documents, you'll see that a lot in the use restrictions, that you may not run a business out of your home. And if you're renting your home out like a hotel, like a VRBO, or like it's like I said, by the night, essentially by the night or by the week, it's running a business and it's a short-term rental. But again, please make sure you check with your association attorney on how they would recommend how you guys can use Airbnb, try to get those to stop in your community. What if you don't have any leasing provisions, or your leasing provisions are very vague? Again, I'm here that you need to consult with your association's attorney to have an amendment drafted and delivered to the membership. Okay. Draft them and file them, with the county land records after you've gotten your required vote, which you see most common 2/3 affirmative vote. But I've seen other, percentages of what you need to get as far as the membership voting on the amendment. A lot of times when you do want to get, when you have a community with a lot of leasing and you want to establish a cap or other provisions for your community, what a lot of boards are having to do is grandfather in. So you'll see that a lot, grandfather in those people that are already leasing so that you can get them to sign the lease. Another common provision that you're starting to see more of now is most of the time in general, a lease permit, when somebody has a lease permit to lease their home, there's a cap, there's only 10 people that can lease. Most of the time, that owner that's leasing owns their permit until they sell their home. Meaning when they sell their home and ownership transfer happens, that lease permit does not pass on to the new owner. Okay. However, I have seen some associations where that does pass on to the new owner. So again, you got to check your governing documents. But what we're starting to see more often now is a cap on how long you may have an open permit. So if you have a cap in your community, 5%, 10%, whatever it is, okay, you're starting to see a lot of amendments that state that that permit that you've received is only good for 2 years. or 3 years, meaning you're only going to be able to lease that unit out for so many years, and then you're going to lose that permit. And you'll have to go back on the wait list if you want to lease your home out again. What that does is that's giving opportunity for other homeowners in the community to lease their home out. Okay. Let's see. So what kind of records, information do you need to keep on file for leased out units or lots? Landlord owner contact information, including, very important, including a correct mailing address. Okay. We have to be able to communicate with the landlord and know how to get in touch with them and not just have their property address. It is incumbent on the landlord owner / investor, again, they're all three the same people, to ensure that the management company has the correct mailing address or correct contact information for them. We need to have an updated lease and the lease terms, again, start date and end date on file. We need to have the tenant name, email, phone number, and then of course any other documents that might be required per your leasing provisions. Like I said, maybe there's an insurance documentation that's needed or an acknowledgement form that might be needed. So I'm going to end it with this, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. If you guys have questions about the lease monitoring program, I will tell you, Ardent Residential, we have the best lease monitoring program system that the industry has to offer, hands down. And if you want more information about how to get your community enrolled, please email us at info@myardent.com. Thank you guys for joining me tonight. This webinar will also be posted on our webinar page on our myardent.com website. And if you have any other questions, again, please don't hesitate to email info@myardent.com. Hope you guys have a wonderful evening and a fantastic weekend ahead. Thank you so much for joining.